Hello, here's yet another explainer video on English Language A-Level. This one is about language gender. It's the second video that I've done about language gender. In the first one, we looked at folk linguistics and Lacov's deficit model. And on this one, we're going to be grappling with two other Ds. We're going to be looking at the dominance model and the difference model. Dominance model. So this is a belief that circulates in the 1970s and the 1980s that males dominate conversations. Okay, and this arises from hierarchical dominance of men in society. So if we live in a patriarchal society where it's males who are controlling the institutions in public life, then that's going to be reflected in the kind of power dynamics that are going on in everyday conversations, not just in public conversations, but in casual kind of private conversations as well. So this study arises from the context of second wave feminism. First wave feminism are all the victories won by people like the suffragettes in the early 20th century, where women are given equal rights. But we get to the 1970s and 80s, and still there is a major imbalance in power structures in society. Males dominate public life, and therefore men are positioned above women through social and political power. And males unconsciously or even consciously are using conversation to reinforce power. So this is discussed by researchers, people like Dale Spender, in a book called Man-Made Language. Here's Pamela Fishman. She's one of the prime movers in what we're calling the dominance model. So she did a study in 1980 of conversations between three American couples, and she drew similar conclusions to Lacov. Note, by the way, the rather narrow demographic that we've got theories being put forward, but it seems to be based on a very narrow sort of range of people. We know that Lacov did her study on her friends, middle-aged Californians, in the mid-1970s, and here Pamela Fishman is doing one step up, because this is actually a study that's based on real data, but still it's a very narrow demographic which is being drawn upon. Fishman viewed the kind of thing that women were doing in conversations as a result of their inferior social status. That basically women are working harder in conversations, they're initiating conversation, they're doing more to maintain conversations, they're doing what she memorably called conversational shit work. And so Fishman claims that this is due to male dominance, and males are reluctant to do the heavy lifting in conversation because of what they perceive to be their dominant role. Okay, and this is backed up with some research findings. Zimmerman and West, this is a very famous study. They went around college campuses, again in California, in the mid-1970s, and they came up with a startling statistic that in the data that they collected in mixed gender conversations, if you looked at the interruptions going on, males were responsible for, yes, 96% of those interruptions. So according to their study, men speak more, men have longer turns, and they're interrupted less, whilst of course they're interrupting much, much more. Okay, and so Dale Spender, building on this, interpreted women's silence as a form of oppression because men are speaking more. Dale Spender interprets that as a form of oppression. There's a number of great videos on the net which explain these things. That's a good one for you to be watching. Just type in Zimmerman and West's study 1975. Here's a recall task then. So far, summarise the dominance gender approach, summarise Fishman's contribution to the dominance model, and summarise how Zimmerman and West works linked to the debates about gender theory. Who's this? Well, this is Deborah Tannen, another American researcher, and she really kickstarts what's called the difference approach. And basically, Deborah Tannen argues that male-female conversation, it's not about power necessarily, it's not about males dominating the conversations or women using weak language, It's just that there is a cultural difference between males and females. Males grow up playing as children together and females playing together. Their expectations through society are different. They grow up with different discourses. That's what Deborah Tannen is arguing. And therefore, when you've got public life and males and females working together and in, human relationships, there is often miscommunication. And so she likens it a bit to, let's say, a European going across to Japan in order to conduct some kind of business there, that there are elements of Japanese culture that the European traveller needs to understand in order to do successful business work there. And so what she's arguing, it's the same with males and females, that we need to understand the culture of the other gender. Okay, and her big claim is that females tend to be more inclined to be cooperative in conversation, whereas males tend to be more competitive. Cooperativeness versus competitiveness. And she coined this phrase, genderless. We know lect on the end of a word means the language of, so she coins this term, genderless, to describe the different language use of men and women. And this has spawned the great big cottage industry. Popular, non-academic, self-help relationship books hit the stores, and often they present these differences between males and females in a very stereotypical way. I'm thinking about things like John Gray's "Men are from Mars, women are from Venus." Okay, so in Tannen's book, You Just Don't Understand, Men and Women in Conversation, she labelled pairs of differences between males and females, and you find these in your textbook. So let's look at these as kind of binary opposites. This is, of course, simplifying things a great deal, and she would argue that it's a lot more complicated than this, but this is the kind of broad ideas coming through here. She says that males tend to use language to demonstrate status, whereas females tend to use language in order to show support. Okay, so males are more likely to say things like, I'll share the meeting, because at the heart of their communication, it's very important that they have status. Whereas women are much more likely to use language that says things like, well, we can lead the meeting between us if you like, where, it's the first person plural pronoun that's being used. It's an epistemic modal auxiliary verb, can. It's trying to use language in order to support other people. Status versus support. The next one is about advice versus understanding. Go to a man with a problem, and he's likely to interpret that as, you need some advice, some guidance. So he'll say something like, you need to tell the manager straight away. Okay. Go to a woman with a problem, and she's perhaps more likely to think, well, this is a person who wants understanding. So that's a really tough situation. No wonder you were irritated. Advice versus understanding. Remember, these are very stereotypical, actually, the way that I'm presenting it, but you're getting the general idea. We have orders versus proposals, so males are more likely to be more direct in giving instructions, whereas females are more likely to hedge a little bit more by giving proposals. We could meet there at 8. We have males who perhaps are happier in showing conflict, saying things like, I'm sick of your attitude, and females who are perhaps happier in using language which is more compromising, like, I think we both could take a step back from this. And then finally, independence versus intimacy. The frustrating refusal sometimes of males not to speak about problems and issues, whereas women see communication as a good opportunity to show intimacy. Okay, status versus support, advice versus understanding, orders versus proposal, conflict versus compromise, independence versus intimacy. Very stereotypical, I know. Is there some germ of truth, do you think, in what Deborah Tannen is arguing? The great video here where she does a talk gender-specific language rituals that's really worth watching. She's backed up by other researchers. So these aren't just claims made out of thin air, but there's lots of researchers who are looking at data, everyday data of casual conversation. Here we've got Jennifer Coates. Jennifer Coates produces a book called Women Talk, and she argues that children, boys and girls, they tend to belong to same-sex friendship groups when they grow up, and subsequently they tend to develop quite different styles of speaking. So Coates theorizes that female language is much more cooperative in single-sex conversations, and she hones in on those tag questions. Remember, there's so much research being done in linguistics about tag questions. She views tag questions and modality, using modal verbs or hedging, as characteristics that help to make women's talk supportive and much more cooperative. So that's Jennifer Coates. You've also got Jane Pilkington. Jane Pilkington argues that women in same-sex conversations also are more collaborative, and they're more likely to use positive politeness strategies. So they're more likely to be overtly complimentary to their listener. She found that males, on the other hand, certainly in same-sex talk, were a lot less collaborative, they were a lot less complimentary, and they seemed a lot less supportive than the females. So you've got Coates and you've got Pilkington, and these are mentioned in the AQA textbook on page 178. So we'll wrap this up with a little bit of journalism. So this is taken from The Guardian. And this is interesting because we're thinking, well, to what extent does this back up the gender research that we've talked about so far? Because we talked about the 3 Ds, the deficit model, the dominance model, and the difference model. So here's an article from a left-wing broadsheet newspaper, and the title of it is "Women Told to Speak Their Minds to Get On in Boardrooms. Study shows that language used by female executives in meetings harms their prospects." So as we're reading this, you need to think, well, how does it link in? Does this evidence here challenge or does it support any of the Ds that we've talked about? Women, including those who work in senior positions for some of the country's leading firms, are held back from reaching the very highest levels in business because of the difficulties they find in striking the right tone of language during high-pressure meetings. This claim is made by linguistics expert Dr. Judith Baxter, who undertook an 18-month study into the speaking patterns of men and women at meetings in 7 major well-known companies, including 2 in the FTSE 100. The research found that women were 4 times more likely than men to be self-deprecating, to use humour, and to speak indirectly or apologetically when broaching difficult subjects with board members in order to avoid conflict. And it doesn't always work. Baxter said such language, which the study described as DVD, double voice discourse, was used because women were often heavily outnumbered on boards. So as a result, senior women engage in a kind of linguistic second guessing, adjusting their language to make the right impact on colleagues. So examples included beginning comments with phrases such as, "I'm probably speaking out of turn, but sorry to cut across you like that, but..." When employed effectively, this kind of language could be a useful tool to manipulate those around them, she claimed, but self-deprecation and an apologetic style were risky because striking a wrong note could lead to appearing defensive and weak. Okay, so you might want to sort of stop the video there and think, well, how are any of these claims, how do they link with the gender theory that we've talked about so far on the 3 Ds, the deficit model, dominance, and difference? Okay, thank you very much.